Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a world that was colder, quieter, and far less convenient than anything we have now. A world where the only home security system was a pile of thorny branches and the distant hope that a hungry cave bear was feeling lazy. So go ahead, settle in, dim the lights, let your shoulders drop a little, because tonight we're sinking into the very long, very sleepy story of how humans, fragile, bipedal, chronically underfed humans, somehow turned wolves into dogs, and then convinced ourselves it was our idea all along. Just take a slow breath, and let's begin. The tale starts somewhere in the late Ice Age, which was unsurprisingly very icy. Picture vast white plains, stiff winds, and early humans huddled around flickering fires. Most of them were wearing what can only be described as prehistoric oversized hoodies, stitched together from animal skins with questionable sewing technique. Life was simple, difficult, and repetitive. Wake up, avoid being eaten, gather food, attempt to not freeze, repeat. It was a slow-paced existence, which makes it perfect for bedtime storytelling. And wandering across those frigid landscapes were wolves, not the friendly tongue-lolling, tail-wagging kind you see at dog parks now. No. These were elegant, muscled creatures with sharp teeth, sharp instincts, and the general vibe of animals who had absolutely no intention of being domesticated. But hunger changes priorities, and Ice Age winters were long. So we drift into one of the prevailing theories, not a dramatic, cinematic showdown, but a quiet, almost accidental partnership. Imagine a group of wolves, slowly trailing after human hunting camps, sniffing the air, hoping for scraps. Humans were inefficient hunters, after all. They left leftovers, bits of bone, food waste, and wolves, in the great tradition of future Labrador retrievers everywhere, loved leftovers. At first, humans didn't mind. The wolves kept their distance. They weren't trying to hang out by the fire or join the family. They were simply looking for calories. And humans who were fully aware of their place on the food chain quickly realized that wolves lingering near the perimeter had a surprising benefit. They barked, not the refined, well-practiced bark of a modern dog, more like an abrupt, startled, "Who are you and why are you here?" kind of sound. But wolves, being exceedingly good at noticing danger, tended to alert the camp when something larger and hungrier approached. Early humans didn't domesticate wolves at this point. They simply tolerated them. They didn't give them names. They didn't toss sticks. They didn't say, "Who's a good boy?" because language had not yet evolved to the point where one could properly compliment a wolf. But the arrangement persisted. The wolves that lingered closest were the least aggressive, the most curious, the most food motivated, essentially the ancient equivalent of modern golden retrievers. Humans began to realize that these specific wolves posed little threat. They were willing to hang around without trying to bite anyone important. From there, something subtle happened. Maybe a human tossed a bone just a little closer. Maybe a wolf approached just a little more boldly. Nothing dramatic. Just small, incremental steps over centuries, generations, millennia. Slowly, wolves were selecting themselves. The shy ones stayed away. The aggressive ones were driven off. And the ones who were calm, friendly, and had that special "please adopt me" face lingered near human settlements. They reproduced near those settlements. Their offspring inherited those calmer temperaments. And humans, being opportunistic creatures with plenty of free time during long winters, began interacting with them more deliberately. This early stage of domestication was not glamorous. No one had a leash. No one was teaching sit, stay, or heel. There were no matching sweaters. These animals still looked like wolves, sleek, wild, and ready to bolt if someone sneezed too loudly. But humans began to notice something remarkable. Wolves were useful. They could track scents far better than people could. They understood the environment. They could locate prey. And they had the invaluable ability to discourage intruders by merely existing. So early humans began the cautious, slow work of drawing these animals closer, feeding them little bits, interacting with pups, and forming the earliest bonds. It wasn't affection at first, it was practicality. But practicality has a funny way of turning into attachment over time. Let's drift forward a few centuries. Now we have wolves that are noticeably different. Softer features, more rounded heads, less suspicious eyes. Still not dogs yet, but definitely on the path. Humans began sharing more food with them, especially during long hunts. Hunters realized that the animals could help track prey, herd it, and even corner it. In return, they got scraps and a slightly elevated social position compared to other animals lingering around human camps. This was not a royal court, no velvet pillows, no golden food bowls, but it was something, as these wolfish companions integrated into human lives. Something endearing happened. Early humans started caring for injured pups. That was a major turning point. Caring for a wounded animal has no immediate practical benefit. It suggests something deeper, an emotional shift. You don't treat an injured wolf pup unless a part of you wants it to survive. Humans began speaking to them, not in full sentences, obviously, but in the soft, reassuring tones that humans instinctively use when they want something small and furry to calm down. Wolves responded. Tails began wagging, awkward, hesitant, barely noticeable at first, but growing more familiar over generations. As groups migrated, the not-quite wolves traveled with them. They were becoming helpers, companions, and strange furry extensions of the human family. And over many lifetimes, physical features began shifting to natural selection favored wolves that cooperated with humans. Their faces became rounder, their ears sometimes flopped, their coats grew into varied patterns, their eyes softened, and at some point, no one knows exactly when it happened, the first protodog crawled into an early human's sleeping area and curled up for warmth, a shared moment of comfort. Two species that had once eyed each other with deep suspicion, now sharing body heat in the cold Ice Age night. Let's drift a little further. By the time humans formed more settled communities, dogs were unmistakably dogs. They had jobs. Some guarded the camp, some helped hunt, some helped herd early livestock, and some, inevitably, did absolutely nothing except sit around looking adorable, which has been a core canine job description ever since. Dogs became woven into human mythology. They guided souls into the afterlife in some cultures. They protected families. They accompanied hunters. They appeared in burial sites, curled up beside humans, testament to shared closeness. In many ancient societies, dogs became small symbols of status, not royal status. Yet those stories will come later, but the earliest hints appear. A well-fed dog implied a household with resources. A trained dog implied skill and patience. A dog that understood commands implied long-term care and attention. These animals were becoming companions in every sense. Now we drift into the softer part of this history, the emotional thread. Because for all the practical uses, the real shift, the deep bond that still exists today came from something more subtle. Dogs learned to understand human expressions. They developed the rare ability to read human faces. They noticed when a human was sad, tense, angry, or relaxed. They watched our posture. They listened to tone. They understood gestures. And humans, for their part, learned to love the loyalty dogs offered. Dogs didn't judge. They didn't scheme. They didn't complain about living conditions. They simply formed bonds, showed affection, and remained steadfast. By the time ancient civilizations formed, dogs had become indispensable. Egyptians loved them sometimes even more than cats, which is saying something. Greeks admired their loyalty. Romans kept dogs for protection and companionship. They wrote about them. They carved them into artwork. They buried them with honors, all from an Ice Age agreement that began with scavenging scraps. Now, let's drift into the more endearing details of this ancient companionship. Imagine a small farming village at the dawn of agriculture. Morning mist on the fields, the smell of earth, a handful of huts arranged in a loose circle. Somewhere between them trots a dog, sturdy, confident, and only mildly aware of how important he is. He checks the perimeter. He sniffs the ground. He watches the livestock with the seriousness of someone who has no idea what livestock actually are, but is determined to guard them anyway. Children call out to him. He pretends not to hear because that is timeless dog behavior, but eventually trots over. Someone offers him a scrap from breakfast. Someone else scratches behind his ears. It's simple, it's peaceful, and it's the beginning of something ancient and familiar. These early dogs weren't purebred. They didn't look like the stylish, dramatic canines of modern dog shows. They were medium-sized, fluffy in inconsistent ways, occasionally funny-looking, and built for survival. But they were loved, and they returned that loyalty in full measure. Now imagine another moment late at night. A family sleeps inside a hut. Embers glow faintly in the fire pit. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, the quiet lift of ears, a soft growl, a warning. Maybe a wild animal is prowling, or a traveler is approaching the village. The dog barks. The humans wake. They light a torch. Danger passes. A partnership reinforced. Another small layer of trust added. This happened countless times across thousands of years. Enough that humans began to carve images of dogs into pottery, decorate collars, and develop early training methods. They realized that different dogs excelled at different tasks. Some were fast, some were clever, some were strong, some were incredibly stubborn. Another timeless canine trait, but useful in certain situations. Over time, selective breeding emerged. Not formal breeding, more like, those two dogs are good at guarding. Let's let them have puppies. Or that one hunts well. Maybe his offspring will too. Traits solidified, roles emerged, and slowly, human communities looked incomplete without a dog or two trotting around. This journey took tens of thousands of years, but the ending is familiar. Today, dogs rest on couches, snore loudly in living rooms, and occasionally steal entire rotisserie chickens from kitchen counters. But the Bonthe deep, ancient bond started with a few brave wolves who wandered closer than the rest, who looked at humans and thought, maybe these strange, furless creatures are worth trusting. And humans, against all odds, thought the same. Let's drift onward, into part 2, where the story continues with early civilizations, royal households, and the moment dogs officially entered the world of elites. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're settling in, again maybe adjusting your pillow, maybe letting your eyelids feel just a little heavier, you're in exactly the right place. Tonight, we're continuing our slow, wandering drift through the ancient story of how dogs moved from campfires into kingdoms. So take a breath, a quiet one, and let's drift forward together. When human societies began shifting from small, wandering groups to settled villages, dogs were already fully woven into daily life. They weren't accessories, they weren't status symbols, they were co-workers, and occasionally freeloaders, depending on the dog. But as villages turned into towns, and towns turned into kingdoms, an interesting new phenomenon appeared. Dogs started entering the world of elites, not suddenly, not with a dramatic royal decree, more like a slow slide, one paw at a time into the highest social circles. It turns out wealthy people liked dogs for the same reason everyone else did. They were loyal, useful, and extremely good at pretending to understand humans. Let's drift gently into the first known royal dog lovers, the ancient Mesopotamians. Mesopotamians, where the first officially important dogs appeared. Picture early Mesopotamia. Hot sun, clay buildings, irrigation canals, people in linen robes, walking around doing important-looking things, usually involving grain. And somewhere in the mix, dogs lean, short-haired, long-legged animals, trotting through the streets like they absolutely owned the place. Some dogs guarded fields, some protected granaries, some herded goats, and some quite impressively worked in temples. The goddess, Gula, healer of ailments and general protector of not dying painfully, had dogs as her sacred companions. Images of her often show a large dog sitting calmly beside her, looking proud, wise, and, frankly, more reliable than most human assistants. These weren't pampered palace pets yet. but they were respected, valued, given roles in religion and medicine. They appear on seals, statues, and clay figurines. And then, as cities expanded, kings, by the way, noticed everything that made them look more powerful. So when they saw loyal, protective dogs that followed orders and intimidated intruders with minimal effort, they thought, yes, I should have one of those, preferably several. And just like that, royal kennels were born. Not glamorous ones. There were no chandeliers, no velvet cushions, just designated areas where dogs were cared for, fed, and trained. These Mesopotamian dogs were the ancestors of many modern breeds known for loyalty and guard instincts. Muscular, focused, and probably very confused about why the king had so many enemies sneaking around at night. Let's float a little further east, ancient Egypt, where dogs started getting fancy. Egyptians loved animals. They adored cats, worshipped ibises, respected bulls, and had a curious fondness for crocodiles. That really says a lot about their willingness to take risks. But dogs were companions. They appear on tomb walls trotting beside hunters. They show up in household scenes, curled under chairs. They often had names, actual names, carved into collar plaques, written on tombs, names like Tiaiku, Beben, and my personal favorite from one excavation, Useless, which feels like a deeply honest moment from an ancient pet owner. Egyptian dogs fell into two general categories: hunting companions and house guardians. Some were sleek, fast, and built for sprinting across the desert after gazelles. Others were stockier and better at scaring off thieves, jackals, and anyone who walked too confidently near the royal pantry. Pharaohs themselves kept dogs. They trained them. They buried them with honors. Some pharaohs even placed their dogs in sarcophagi, implying that their afterlife plans absolutely included This was the first time in history that dogs were treated not just as workers, but as beloved extensions of elite households. And yes, some royal dogs were spoiled. There were collars made of leather embossed with gold. There were burial offerings. Some dogs had better funerals than most peasants, naturally. Let's drift north for a moment. Ancient Greece, where dogs became philosophically interesting. The Greeks loved analyzing everything. They analyzed stars, politics, geometry, and the ideal shape of a person's nose. So of course, they also analyzed dogs. Dogs in Greece were hunters, guardians, and companions. They appear in myths as loyal guides, like the three-headed Cerberus, who admittedly had too many heads to be a practical pet, but symbolically represented ultimate devotion to duty. Greek households kept dogs as early warning systems. A barking dog was considered more reliable than many servants, which, based on Greek comedies, says a lot about ancient servants. And then there was Odysseus's dog, Argos, who waited 20 years for his master to return, wagged his tail once, and immediately died. A very Greek way of expressing devotion, touching, dramatic, a little sad, and guaranteed to make future storytellers sigh deeply. Aristotle admired dogs. So did Plato. They saw something noble in their instinctive loyalty. Spartan warriors raised dogs that accompanied them in training, which means somewhere in ancient Laconia, a dog definitely witnessed a group of teenagers voluntarily rolling in nettles and thought, humans are strange. But the major development in Greece was the idea of dogs as companions of gentlemen, not just hunters, not just guards, but personal friends, walking partners, silent advisors, a role they still hold today, minus the togas. Let's float west now, to the empire that truly elevated dog ownership into something almost royal, Rome, where dogs entered the world of elite luxury. Roman society adored dogs so much that every other civilization quietly raised an eyebrow. There were small lapdogs carried by nipple women, long-legged hunting hounds kept by senators, stocky mastiff types bred for protection, and of course, the famous cave canim, mosaics, beware of the dog, found at doorways across the empire. Some of them featured dogs that looked intensely ferocious. Others featured dogs that looked like they would panic if a leaf fell too loudly. Classic Roman variety. Wealthy Romans wrote poems about their dogs. Martial, the poet, wrote an entire epitaph for a girl's tiny lapdog, calling her the jewel of Publius. This is history's earliest recorded example of someone being unreasonably dramatic about a small, fluffy creature. Roman emperors, naturally, took dog keeping to extreme levels. They imported exotic breeds from far-off lands. They trained them for war, hunting, sport, and companionship. Some emperors traveled with entire canine entourages. Imagine the palace hallways of Nero, where opulence met questionable decision-making. Marble floors, gold-trimmed statues, and dogs trotting around wondering why the emperor was on the roof, pretending to be Apollo again. Yet the role of dogs in Rome wasn't all luxury. Many served as guards. Some pulled small carts. Some herded livestock on farms. Dogs were everywhere across classes, jobs, and lifestyles. Rome is where we see the earliest signs of breed diversity by design. People intentionally matched certain dogs for size, temperament, or ability. Not formal breeding yet, but the beginnings of specialization. And through all this, dogs continued to sleep beside hearths, accompany travelers, and curl up beside children at night. A quiet through line of companionship. How dogs slipped into the palaces and stayed there as civilizations advanced. Kings and queens noticed something. Dogs made them look good. They symbolized loyalty. They symbolized power. They symbolized wealth because feeding a dog well meant you had enough food to spare. And, importantly, they were excellent at biting people who annoyed you. Early royal households used dogs as living security systems long before guards wearing fancy plumes existed. A dog sleeping outside a royal tent was often the difference between safety and an unpleasant early morning surprise involving rival warriors. Over time, royal dogs became more specialized. Some were giant protectors, the early ancestors of mastiffs. Others were small, decorative creatures bred to fit comfortably on a lap hand. Also to keep fleas away from the royal body, which is perhaps the least glamorous royal duty in history. Imagine an early palace scene. A marble courtyard, a fountain, a king sitting on a carved throne, wearing a crown that definitely needed readjusting every 2 minutes. Beside him sits a dog alert, trained, perfectly groomed. A silent message, look at me. Even my animals are impressive. This is where we begin seeing the first elite dog breeding. Royal kennels became common. Handlers were hired. Dogs received better food than most workers, and kings proudly gifted puppies to other rulers as political gestures. Because nothing says please Dan T invade us this spring like offering someone a very cute dog. A soft pause before we continue. Let your eyes soften for a moment. Let the pace slow. We're drifting through thousands of years of quiet companionship. Dogs started at the edges of human camps. They moved to family hearths, then to temples, then to city streets, and eventually into palaces, onto thrones uninvited, and into the most comfortable cushions in royal chambers. In part 3, we'll drift into the medieval world where royal dogs became symbols of lineage, loyalty, and elegance, and sometimes had more political influence than certain nobles. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're settling even deeper into your blanket, letting your breathing slow, letting the room soften around the edge, you're right where you should be. Tonight, we drift into the medieval world, where dogs wandered beside peasants, sat under banquet tables, and somehow found their way into royal intrigues, usually by accident, occasionally on purpose. So take a slow breath, and let's drift gently forward. The medieval world, where dogs became social icons. When the Middle Ages began, Europe was a patchwork of small kingdoms, damp castles, smoky halls, and questionable hygiene. Life was noisy, muddy, and filled with livestock wandering through places they probably shouldn't. And, of course, dogs were everywhere. Not dogs as we know them today, no poodles in sweaters, no polished show breeds, no Instagram-ready poses. These medieval canines were rugged, practical, and slightly scruffy, Think of them as the medieval version of that one dog in every village who looks like he has been through 12 adventures before breakfast. But something important was happening. Dogs were becoming symbols of identity. Peasants kept small hunting dogs. Soldiers kept lean hounds that followed them through battle camps. Merchants had fluffy little watchdogs who barked at everything, including barrels, breezes, and their own reflections. And nobles. Well, nobles took dog keeping to an entirely new level. Let's drift into that world. Noble hounds, the medieval status symbol. Imagine a medieval noble procession winding through a forest. Men in chainmail on horseback, banners fluttering in the wind, and running beside them sleek hunting hounds, long-legged, narrow-faced, and bred for speed. These were the medieval elite of the canine world, the ancestors of greyhounds, salukis, Irish wolfhounds, and other elegant breeds. Owning such dogs was not just a hobby, it was a public display of rank. The more impressive your dogs, the more impressive you were. Kings often traveled with entire packs. These weren't the friendly household pets you curl up with. These were disciplined, athletic animals, trained for hunts that sometimes lasted all day. They slept in special kennels. They had handlers. They even had detailed dietary instructions. Some ate better than half the aristocracy. But noble dogs weren't only for hunting. They carried symbolic meaning, loyalty, nobility, bravery, all the traits rulers claimed to have in abundance, whether or not they actually did. Which brings us to one of the Middle Ages' most interesting developments, the rise of the royal lapdog. The lapdog revolution, from castle floors to silk cushions, while noblemen boasted about their massive hunting breeds. Noblewomen introduced something new into the royal household: tiny dogs. Dogs small enough to sit on laps, sleep in beds, and occasionally get lost inside the folds of heavy dresses. These little dogs, early ancestors of Pekingese Papillons, toy spaniels, and other miniatures, were bred for one purpose: to be adorable. That's it. That was the entire job description. And it worked. Medieval royal women adored them. Queens carried them during processions. Princesses kept them as companions. Aristocratic ladies tucked them into their long sleeves, which is arguably the most fashionable and least practical form of dog transportation ever invented. Lapdogs had other purposes too, purposes that, frankly, are not very glamorous. One of them, flea diversion. The idea was that if a small dog slept close to you, fleas might choose the dog instead. Yes, medieval lapdogs were essentially tiny, fuzzy decoys, and yes, royalty still loved them anyway. Naturally, these dogs lived luxurious lives. Velvet cushions, perfumed baths, polished collars. Some even had their own servants. The average medieval villager was lucky to own a wooden spoon. But a royal lapdog might have a gold-plated water dish. We can drift now into the world of kings who adored their dogs a little too much, because medieval rulers had a habit of forming deeply emotional attachments to their pets, often more than they did with their children. Kings, queens, and their questionable canine priorities. Let's float to England for a moment, where kings were perpetually stressed, occasionally beheaded, and frequently accompanied by dogs. Henry II, for example, kept hunting hounds so valuable that they were ransomed like noble prisoners of war. Imagine being a medieval soldier and having to negotiate the release of a dog. A very royal dog, yes, but still a dog. Edward III bred greyhounds that were so majestic he sometimes gifted them to other rulers as diplomatic gestures, which is honestly a much more pleasant foreign policy than all the alternatives medieval Europe usually came up with. And then there was Mary, Queen of Scots, whose tiny lapdog became weirdly famous for staying with her during her execution. The little dog hid underneath her skirts, refused to leave, and basically traumatized every guard present. Not exactly uplifting, but deeply loyal. In France, the Valois kings kept entire royal kennels stocked with dozens, sometimes hundreds of hunting hounds. These dogs were cared for by high-ranking officials. Their expenses were meticulously recorded. Their diets were managed. Some of them even had better medical care than the royal soldiers. Meanwhile, peasants were out in the fields hoping their boots didn't leak. Another classic medieval contrast. Now let's wander to the royal courts where lapdogs took center stage. Royal women and their spoiled but charming canines in medieval courts. Women often lived structured, restricted, and intensely scrutinized lives. But dogs offered something they rarely got elsewhere: emotional comfort, company, unconditional loyalty, entertainment during long, boring court ceremonies. Queen Elizabeth Woodville of England reportedly kept small, fluffy dogs that followed her around like furry shadows. Catherine de' Medici adored her tiny spaniels so much that court gossip accused her of letting them attend council meetings, which is probably untrue, but entirely believable. And then there was Isabella of Bourbon, who loved her dogs so deeply that her husband commissioned a long procession of carved dogs on her tomb. Dozens of them, their little stone faces lined up around the base, looking loyal for eternity. It's one of the most touching, quietly sentimental monuments in medieval Europe. Medieval dog jobs. The four-paw workforce. Not all medieval dogs lived in palaces. Most had actual jobs. Hunting dogs, fast, disciplined, trained from puppyhood. They chased deer, boar, and sometimes very startled rabbits. Guard dogs, large, muscular, and capable of convincing intruders to reconsider their life choices. Sheep, intelligent, quick, and secretly running every medieval farm with more competence than many human overseers. Butcher dogs, stationed outside meat shops to bark at thieves or opportunistic cats. Street dogs, unofficial trash collectors, loud, unpredictable, occasionally heroic. Dogs were everywhere in medieval towns, wandering streets, sleeping in doorways, trotting beside ox carts, or begging outside bakeries, mastering the art of sad eyes for free bread. And through all of this, humans kept forming deeper bonds with them. A quiet, drifting pause if your breathing has slowed, if the room feels softer, if your thoughts are drifting like a medieval hound, wandering lazily across a quiet courtyard. You're right where we want to be, because the story of humans and dogs, ice and tea, a tale of big events. It's a long, gentle evolution of companionship. But to see how dogs moved from medieval hearths into Renaissance courts where they became symbols of elegance, intelligence, and sometimes absurd levels of pampering will continue in part 4. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've settled deeper into your pillow, maybe letting your jaw loosen, maybe letting your shoulders melt a little heavier into the bed, perfect. Tonight, we drift into the Renaissance, an age of paintings, palaces, politics, and dogs who were suddenly treated with the kind of luxury most humans could only dream of. So take a soft breath, let it fall out slowly, and let's wander into another quiet chapter of our long, sleepy story. The Renaissance, where dogs became works of art. As Europe's medieval fog lifted, something new swept across the continent. The idea that beauty mattered, art mattered, clothing mattered, architecture mattered. Everything needed to look elegant, refined, and a little dramatic. Even the dogs. If medieval dogs were rugged and practical, Renaissance dogs were curated, styled, shaped, painted, groomed, blended into portraits like accessories that breathed, wagged, and occasionally drooled on very expensive clothing. A Renaissance noble didn't just keep a dog, they displayed it. And painters loved dogs. They added warmth to portraits. They suggested loyalty, devotion, and wealth. They also helped fill awkward, empty spaces beside a stiff, uncomfortable noble who had been standing still for 6 hours. Let's drift into the courts where this canine aesthetic blossomed. Italy, the stylish birthplace of the lapdog era. Imagine a Renaissance villa. Sunlight filtering through carved stone arches, terracotta floors, a noble woman reclining on a cushioned bench while musicians strum lutes nearby. Now imagine the little dog curled beside her, a fluffy, silky creature bred for one purpose, to look adorable and match the decor. Italy adored tiny dogs. They were companions, fashion statements, and occasionally living foot warmers. And in an age where nobility wanted their portraits to express power and tenderness at the same time, a lapdog did the job flawlessly. The Bolognese, Maltese, and early toy spaniels became symbols of elegance. Their white coats were prized, making them look like little clouds drifting through marble halls. They were fed delicacies, brushed daily, and sometimes perfumed, and the nobility took enormous pride in them. Some even kept genealogies for their dogs, something they did not always bother doing for their younger children. In true Renaissance fashion, priorities were artistic. France. The royal kennels get out of hand when the lapdog craze reached France. It did not arrive quietly. French nobles adored their dogs so obsessively that court chroniclers wrote about canine behavior with the same seriousness they used for political treaties. Under Francis I, hunting hounds achieved almost divine status. He kept an entire army of dogs, tended by dozens of handlers. These dogs enjoyed finer meals than many servants and lived in specially designed stone kennels, larger than most peasants' homes. Then came Henry III, possibly the most dog-obsessed ruler in French history. He carried tiny dogs everywhere, into council meetings, into ceremonies, into church services, which annoyed the clergy and amused the rest of Europe. He kept his smallest dogs inside the enormous padded sleeves of his robes, letting their tiny heads poke out like decorative buttons with opinions. Some ambassadors claimed that speaking to the king meant first speaking to the dog, who was, by all accounts, a much better listener. Renaissance France is where pampering became tradition. Lapdogs slept on embroidered pillows. They had miniature furniture. They were fed pastries, and their portraits were painted with the same finesse as royalty, because in the eyes of the court they were royalty, in their own tiny fluffy way. Spain, the court of quiet dignity and very serious spaniels, while France preferred extravagant fluffballs, and Italy delighted in white silk-coated lapdogs. Spain developed a fondness for something a bit more dignified, the Spanish Spaniel. These early spaniels appear in countless court portraits, calm, composed, slightly judgmental. They were the ideal accessory for a ruling family that took solemnity very seriously. Queen Isabella I adored her spaniels. Philip II kept them in his private chambers, where they followed him with silent devotion. And Spanish painters, especially Velázquez, captured them with incredible detail, glossy coats, bright eyes, and a kind of gentle patience that suggests they were used to posing for hours at a time. The Spanish Spaniels were also diplomatic tools. Kings gifted them to foreign courts as symbols of goodwill and sophistication, and because they were excellent travelers, they spread across Europe quickly, influencing breeds everywhere, from England's toy spaniels to France's small hunting dogs. So while other courts focused on glamour or extravagance, Spain gave the world something more refined: the quiet, loyal, well-rounded companion dog, a Renaissance classic. England, where dog breeding became intentional. Medieval England had dogs everywhere, but the Renaissance brought order. English nobles began recording pedigrees. They started keeping stud books. They defined what certain dogs should look like, and they weren't shy about bragging when they thought they'd bred a perfect example. Hunting breeds especially became formalized. The early bloodhound with its deep wrinkles and unmatched scent tracking, the mastiff, enormous and intimidating, guarding estates with stoic patience, the British Spaniel, lively and endlessly energetic, perfect for flushing game from underbrush. But England also embraced lap dogs. Queen Elizabeth I adored small spaniels. Her successor, James I, took things even further, discussing his dogs in letters with more warmth than he used for describing his children. In portraits from the Tudor and Stuart courts, dogs appear almost as frequently as jewels. They symbolize loyalty, tenderness, and occasionally the monarch's inability to sit still long enough for a painter to finish their shoes. But the real shift in England came when nobles began intentionally pairing dogs to produce specific traits: bigger paws, narrower noses, fluffier tails, more appealing ears. Breeding became both an art and a science. This laid the groundwork for what would eventually become modern breed standards. But for now, let's drift back into the broader history. Renaissance dog jobs, beauty meets purpose, even as dogs became palatial decoration. Many still worked hard, hunting dogs still essential for royal sport, which doubled as a way for nobles to show off how well-fed and coordinated they were. Messenger dogs trained to run long distances, with notes tied to their collars. The Renaissance postal system, featuring motivational treats. Guard dogs placed at castle entrances, though many became so pampered that guarding consisted of barking from a safe distance. Ship dogs used by sailors for rat control, companionship, and moral support during long voyages involving questionable food and even more questionable weather. Dogs filled every corner of society, from the marble floors of palaces to the wooden decks of merchant ships. And through all this, the bond between humans and dogs only grew stronger. Dogs in Renaissance art, eternal companions on canvas. If you've ever wandered through an art museum, you have probably seen them. Tiny dogs peeking from velvet skirts, hounds lying beside noblemen, fluffy creatures perched delicately on cushions, spaniels gazing up with soft eyes, mastiffs resting like statues beside their masters. Dogs became symbols of fidelity, innocence, trust, and sometimes wealth. In Renaissance symbolism, a dog at a woman's feet meant marital loyalty. A dog beside a king meant authority and constancy. A tiny lapdog in a noble portrait meant please admire how fashionable I am. Some painters even used dogs to soften the humanity of rulers, making them appear warmer, more approachable, and slightly more willing to share their snacks. The art world immortalized them, which means many Renaissance dogs achieved a level of fame their owners could only dream of. A soft pause before we drift on. If you're still awake, barely. If your breathing has become slow and even. If your thoughts feel like they're gently wandering through quiet palace halls, you're right where the story wants you, because in the next part, we'll drift into the early modern era where dogs became symbols of sophistication, empire, science, and sometimes absurd aristocratic hobbies. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. If you're already drifting off, don't worry. This part is intentionally even softer, even flatter, and possibly even more uneventful than the last, because naturally, we're moving into the world of medieval and early modern royal pet culture. And yes, it's exactly as odd, petty, and deeply unnecessary as it sounds. So get comfortable, settle into the pillows, breathe slowly, and let us drift forward into a time when kings collected dogs the way modern people collect phone chargers constantly, compulsively, and often without any idea where half of them came from. The royal dog mom of Europe. Let's float first into the late Middle Ages, to the court of Queen Isabella of Castile. Yes, the same Isabella who eventually funded Columbus. But long before she was financing questionable transatlantic adventures, she was doing something truly serious, raising a small empire of sweet, pampered, slightly confused hunting dogs. Isabella's royal kennels were almost mythical in size. Chronicles described them like a bustling dog metropolis, complete with caretakers, cooks, trainers, and what we might generously call dog maids. Her greyhounds slept on cushions softer than most peasants would see in their entire lives. Their meals were often better seasoned than the soldiers' rations. And naturally, each dog had a name, but not normal names. No, these were the sort of names only a royal household could produce. Names like Gentileza, Brusca, Hermosa, and my personal favorite, Cazadoran, which sounds like a tiny magician from a children's book. Isabella genuinely loved them. She walked with them, prayed with them, traveled with them, and apparently lectured them as if they were actual advisors. Imagine the queen, dressed in all the layers of late medieval dignity, leaning down to a greyhound and whispering, "Don't embarrass me today," because naturally, dogs do not listen. Even foreign diplomats noticed. One Venetian ambassador wrote very delicately that the Queen's dogs seemed to have unusual access to high-level political events, which is a diplomatic way of saying, yes, the dogs were in the room. Yes, during the entire meeting, the king who loved his dogs more than his children. Let's drift now toward France. Specifically, toward King Charles VIII, a man who ruled one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe, yet struggled with the basic challenges of being a functional adult, like walking through doorways without hitting his head. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Charles VIII adored dogs with the affection and intensity of someone who probably needed another hobby. He kept them everywhere, in the halls, in the gardens, in the royal apartments, and occasionally, according to one irritated chronicler, in the throne room, where they sat very proudly. Charles would personally groom some of them, which horrified his noble courtiers. A king brushing a spaniel was, to them, roughly equivalent to a king knitting socks or washing dishes. Completely unthinkable, but Charles did not care. This was a man who once paused an entire council meeting because one of his dogs looked unhappy. And in case you're wondering, no, he did not pause meetings for his children. His dogs. Absolutely. His heirs. They could wait. Ironically, Charles, lover of dogs, scourge of responsible architecture, ended up dying because he smacked his head on a doorframe, and somewhere in the royal kennel, a small, spoiled spaniel was probably wondering why its breakfast was late. Henry VIII, the one-man disaster who still managed to pamper dogs. Let's drift gently over to Tudor England, a kingdom where one-man Henry VIII, professional wife collector and part-time monarch, managed to create something resembling a dog culture. Though completely by accident, Henry's life was full of drama, but surprisingly, his dogs lived in relative peace. He kept spaniels, greyhounds, and mastiffs, all of which were fed on carefully prepared diets. The cooks actually had instructions: no bones, no tough meat, no food that might burden the royal dog's digestion. Henry was ruthless with people, but extremely gentle with his pets. A dog barked too loudly during a council meeting. Perfectly fine. A nobleman coughed too loudly during a religious debate. Straight to the tower. One of Henry's favorite dogs, a small white terrier, reportedly slept in his private chambers. This was controversial, not because of hygiene, but because people thought the dog might overhear state secrets. Yes, they were worried the terrier would know too much. Henry's generosity even extended internationally. He sent fine hunting dogs as diplomatic gifts, because why send gold or weapons when you could send a greyhound? Kings across Europe ended up owning Tudor dogs, probably without wanting them. Mary, Queen of Scots, the dog at the execution, and then there's the saddest royal dog story of them all. Don't worry, this will still be in the soft, sleepy tone. But it is one of those historical moments that's so striking, it just exists quietly in the background of royal history. When Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed, she brought a small Skye Terrier with her. No one noticed because the dog hid beneath her skirt. When Mary was gone, the little dog refused to leave her side. Even the executioners felt bad. And executioners historically did not feel bad about anything. That tiny dog spent hours lying beside her. A small, faithful creature in a world that had been anything but kind. It's a moment people still talk about, not loudly, not dramatically, but with that soft ache that sits quietly in the corner of history. The dogs who ran a royal household. Let's drift to a slightly more amusing court. The late 17th century palace of Louis XIV, the Sun King, a man famous for inventing modern fashion, ruining people's sleep schedules with unnecessary court rituals, and hosting the single most dramatic collection of lapdogs in Europe. Louis kept small dogs, papillons, and various little fluffy things, whose main job, apparently, was to decorate the palace like living ornaments. The royal records even show a chief controller of the royal dogs, an actual paid role. Every morning, palace officials processed through the halls to greet the king, but first, they had to greet the dogs, which is possibly the most French detail to ever exist. The dogs ate gentle broths prepared by chefs. They slept on embroidered cushions. They attended royal dinners, where they were allowed to wander between the highest-ranking nobles who were forbidden to react, because it was considered bad manners to acknowledge the dogs at all. Imagine being a duke. Fancy embroidered coat, powdered wig, centuries of noble lineage, and a small papillon is nibbling your shoe. while you pretend nothing is happening. Royal dignity at its finest. Anne of Denmark and the great dog tax debacle. Sliding further into the 17th century, we arrive at Anne of Denmark, Queen Consort to James I of England, a woman of dramatic fashion choices, questionable diplomacy, and a sincere, deeply emotional attachment to her pack of hunting dogs, and adored her dogs so much that she refused to attend certain royal events if she thought the dogs couldn't accompany her. This became a problem when Scottish nobles attempted to tax the Queen's dogs. Yes, they tried to impose an official dog tax on the royal household. Anne responded the only way royalty knows how. She ignored it completely. The nobles called it irresponsible. Anne called it Tuesday. Her dogs traveled with her, dined with her, and once reportedly interrupted a royal banquet by chasing a cat across the hall. Naturally, the cat survived. Cats always win in palace environments. The time dogs caused an international incident finally. Let's drift toward a hilariously small diplomatic crisis in the 18th century. Frederick the Great of Prussia loved his Italian greyhounds more than almost any living human. His favorite Beachy followed him everywhere. Ministers whispered that she knew more state secrets than half the royal council. When a visiting ambassador accidentally stepped on one of Frederick's dogs, the king became so cold, distant, and pointedly silent that the poor diplomat spent weeks trying to figure out if he had just doomed an alliance. He hadn't, but Frederick never forgave him. This was a man who commanded armies, shaped European politics, and held a lifelong grudge over one accidental correlated incident. Power, apparently, is a delicate thing. We'll drift on from here. But that concludes part 5, how a quiet wander through the kennels, cushions, and complicated affections of Europe's royal dog lovers. If you're still awake, gently stretch, breathe, and whenever you're ready, hey everyone, welcome back. If your eyes are getting heavy, don't fight it. This part is designed to be extra smooth, extra slow, and only mildly interesting, just enough to keep your mind floating without ever waking you fully. So, settle in, breathe out, and let's drift onward into a softer corner of history, where dogs didn't just sleep in royal chambers or nibble on embroidered slippers. They actually nudged politics, shaped alliances, and occasionally caused the most unintentionally funny diplomatic accidents imaginable. Because of course, humans can barely manage their own governments. Why wouldn't dogs get involved? When dogs accidentally became royal bodyguards, let's float first into the forests of early medieval France, a place full of mist, cold mornings, and kings who believed the world revolved around them. And in fairness, everyone else also believed that. We meet King Dagobert I, a Merovingian ruler who adored his hunting dogs with absolute devotion. These were big, muscular, noble hounds, the kind that looked like they were carved out of oak and fed on pure royal entitlement. One morning, Dagobert wandered a little too far into the woods while hunting Bora, famously bad idea for kings who weren't exactly known for self-preservation. The boar cornered him. The king panicked, and the only living beings who reacted sensibly were his dogs. Several hounds leaped between him and the boar, saving his life. And so, for the rest of his reign, Dagobert treated these dogs like tiny furry dukes. They received better medical care than most of his soldiers. Chroniclers say they attended court, which likely means they wandered around the hall looking slightly bored, which, to be fair, is also what most nobles did. It's one of those quiet little stories that sits at the edge of history. Royal survival. Ode to dogs who probably only wanted breakfast. The dogs who decided a king's marriage. Drifting ahead a few centuries, we wander into the 12th century, where alliances were fragile, kings were dramatic, and everyone believed omens were everywhere. Enter King William II of Sicily, a ruler with a mild talent for governing and a strong talent for believing that dogs had good instincts. When it came time for his arranged marriage, a very serious political matter, William's advisors presented portraits of potential brides. He studied them thoughtfully. He considered alliances, land, power, dynasty, and then, naturally, he He let his dogs choose. Yes, he laid the portraits on the floor, let his dogs sniff them, and whichever one the dogs nudged first, that was the future Queen of Sicily. The dogs picked Joan of England. Fortunately, she turned out to be intelligent, capable, and far too competent for the Sicilian court, honestly. But William swore it was fate, and the dogs got extra treats, probably a small feast. Some historians try to frame this as symbolism or ritual. Others admit it was probably just a king being a bit strange. Royal eccentricities come in many forms. Some built cathedrals, some let dogs choose their wives. When war paused for a dog, let's drift to the 100 Years' War, a long, exhausting conflict between England and France where everyone was tired, hungry, and deeply unimpressed with life. One evening, during a brief lull in the fighting, a small brown dog belonging to an English knight wandered into the French camp. Soldiers on each side started shouting accusations. Tension grew. Swords came out. It was about to become one of those tiny, ridiculous skirmishes that history loves to forget. Then the French commander, who was probably just done with everything, walked up, picked up the dog, and calmly returned him to the English side. No speeches, no drama, just a quiet, "Here, he looks like yours." The English commander thanked him. Everyone awkwardly backed away. And for one evening, the war paused because a dog got lost. It's a soft little moment buried in centuries of conflict. A reminder that even in chaos, someone still cares that a good boy is safely returned home. The emperor who allowed dogs at diplomatic meetings. Now we drift forward into the 16th century, straight into the court of the Habsburgs. And as you may know, the Habsburg family tree was so tangled that it looked like someone tried to make a family chart while blindfolded. But amid all that dynastic confusion, we find Emperor Maximilian II, a man known for being gentle, thoughtful, and very, very devoted to his dogs. Maximilian allowed his dogs to attend official diplomatic meetings. At first, diplomats were alarmed. Should they bow to the dogs? Should they ignore them? Should they pretend they weren't sniffing everyone under the table? One ambassador wrote that the emperor often paused a negotiation to gently pet one of his dogs, as if seeking counsel. And honestly, looking at the political decisions of the era, the dogs were probably the most reasonable advisors in the room. Maximilian once sent a dog as a diplomatic gift to Poland, an elegant greyhound with a velvet collar and a small handwritten letter explaining the dog's personality, as in, he likes gentle pats and dislikes tall hats. It's the kind of detail that reminds you that emperors were just people, with power, poor judgment, and too much affection for animals who had absolutely no concept of politics. The dog who changed the course of an invasion. Let's float now to the Mediterranean, to the island of Malta in 1565 during the Great Siege. This was a brutal event, so we'll keep our tones soft and vague, no harsh details. Just a gentle outline. The Knights of St. John, a chivalric order known for discipline and elaborate fashion choices involving too many crosses, had a mascot named Cacciatore. He was a large dog, likely a Mastiff, loyal and very attached to the knights. One night, enemy forces attempted a surprise attack. The guards were exhausted. The night was quiet, but Cacciatore heard something. He barked and barked and barked. The knights woke up, rushed to the walls, and managed to prevent the assault. The dog saved the island, and he was rewarded with a ceremonial collar, a place of honor, and more food than probably recommended for heart health. He spent the rest of his life wandering the fortress like a retired general, except significantly more loved. When a dog started a royal argument that lasted years. Next, let's drift into the late 17th century, into the marriage of William III and Mary II of England, two rulers who managed to run a kingdom together, while simultaneously being unable to agree on almost anything in their personal lives. Mary loved small lapdogs, elegant, dainty, decorative little creatures. William loved enormous hunting hounds that resembled furry battering rams. Their dogs hated each other, and because of course they did, this led to actual arguments between the king and queen. Mary complained that William's giant dogs were unrefined. William complained that Mary's tiny dogs would not survive a strong breeze. Their ongoing dog feud lasted for years. The entire palace staff knew not to bring up the animals around them, unless they wanted to hear a royal debate that could last 40 minutes and resolve nothing. It's a wonderfully petty snapshot of monarchy. Not wars, not treaties, just two royals arguing about whose dogs were better, which really is the most human thing they ever did. The dog who inherited a royal fortune. Let's float gently into the 18th century, where aristocracy reached new heights of boredom and wealth, an excellent combination for producing strange inheritance decisions. Meet Prince Rupert of the Rhine, a warrior, scientist, and man with an impressive beard. But his real legacy: he left a notable fortune to one of his dogs. The dog, an intelligent white poodle, had accompanied him through battles, meetings, and long stretches of political chaos. And when the prince died, he left money specifically for the dog's care. Enough for comfortable food, a warm place to sleep, and what we might gently call lifestyle maintenance. Some nobles were offended, others were jealous. A few probably wondered if the dog was open to marriage alliances. The dog, meanwhile, carried on living quietly and comfortably, completely unaware that it had become wealthier than most minor European nobles. The dog who became a national symbol before this part drifts to a close. Let's hover in revolutionary France for just a moment, softly, gently, without touching the dramatic parts. Amid all the turbulence, the people embraced a small, fluffy white dog known as the bichon. These dogs had once been favorites of the nobility, prancing through salons and sleeping on cushioned thrones. But during the revolution, they somehow shifted roles. They became symbols of resilience, cuteness, and comforting normalcy. People kept them for companionship, for cheer, for a reminder that life still had softness in it. A tiny dog, surviving the fall of monarchy, and becoming a quiet emblem of comfort. History is strange like that. Dogs don't aim for symbolism. They just exist, and humans, being humans, assign them meaning. And that's where we'll drift to a pause for tonight. A soft coastline between royal eccentricity and political chaos, shaped by paws, fur, and the gentle presence of animals who wandered through palaces without understanding any of it. If you're still awake, your breathing is probably slow now. Your mind is drifting, and whenever you're ready, hey everyone, welcome back. If you're drifting, that's perfect. This next part is meant to feel like a gentle evening walks, steady, unhurried, pleasantly uneventful. Just you, the soft glow of history, and a slow parade of royals who loved their dogs a little too much, or in a few cases, not quite enough. So take a deep breath, loosen your shoulders, let your thoughts grow quieter, and let's drift forward together. When dogs became the ultimate status symbol, as we float into the late medieval and early modern world, something shifts. Yes, dogs are still lovable companions, but they also become accessories, part of the stage set of royal image-making. And no one embraced this quite like the Italian courts of the Renaissance. Imagine a grand Florentine palace, painted ceilings, polished marble, velvet drapes, and, in the middle of the room, a tiny lapdog wearing a jeweled collar that costs more than a merchant's entire house. That was the dog of Lorenzo de' Medici. Lorenzo valued these dogs not simply for affection, but for what they signaled: refinement, wealth, sophistication, and perhaps most importantly, an ability to spoil a creature that had no responsibilities whatsoever. Visitors sometimes wrote about Lorenzo's dogs with more detail than they did about his political reforms. One poet even compared one of Lorenzo's dogs to a small, living pearl, which is a very poetic way of saying, yes, I was bribed to write that, but these dogs mattered. In an age when appearances were everything, a delicate little lapdog could convey more than a speech, a statue, or a diplomatic letter. It quietly said, I'm rich enough to care for this tiny, adorable creature, and also rich enough that I don't have to justify it. When Prague's castle became a dog playground, let's drift north to the court of Rudolph II. the famously eccentric Habsburg emperor who loved dwarfs, exotic animals, rare paintings, and alchemists who definitely promised too much. Naturally, Rudolf also kept dogs, many dogs. He had hunting hounds, lapdogs, sleek foreign breeds, and a few dogs that chroniclers simply called indeterminate, which is a polite way of saying they were mixed breed and very confused. These dogs wandered through the halls of Prague Castle, a sprawling, slightly gloomy complex perched above the city. Visitors often complained that they slipped on floors because dogs had tracked in mud. Ambassadors wrote that they had to proceed with great caution, which is diplomatic language for "I nearly fell on my face." Some dogs even slept in Rudolf's alchemical laboratories, curled up beside furnaces and strange apparatus. It's oddly comforting to imagine alchemists mixing glowing liquids, courtiers whispering about politics, and a dog quietly snoring in the corner. Through all the eccentricity, the dogs were perhaps the most normal beings in the entire palace. Royal hunts that looked more like dog conventions. Let's slide gently into the 17th century, the age of grand royal hunts. For kings like Louis XIII of France, hunting wasn't just a sport, it was a lifestyle, a performance, a political ritual, and a fantastic excuse to bring along 40 to 60 dogs at once. Contemporary accounts describe these hunts like chaotic festivals, horn blasts, clattering horses, swirling autumn leaves, and a sea of dogs in various emotional states. Some were excited, some were confused, some were probably wondering why everyone was running so early in the morning. Louis XIII trusted his dogs more than most courtiers. He even claimed that dogs gave him honest company, which, given the politics of the French court, was probably true. At times, dogs outnumbered humans in these hunting parties. If someone fell off their horse, and someone always fell off their horse, the dogs enthusiastically inspected the situation, which was helpful in spirit but not in practice. Hunting with dogs wasn't just tradition. It was a way for kings to show they were vigorous, masculine, and capable of managing chaos. Although, to be honest, the dogs managed most of the chaos themselves. When dogs became symbols of loyalty drifting forward, we arrive at the Baroque courts of Europe, where symbolism mattered almost as much as comfort. Wigs and excessively complicated clothing. Dogs appear everywhere in portraits, not just because royals liked them, but because they represented loyalty, devotion, and gentle nobility. Look at a portrait of Charles I of England. There's almost always a dog near his boots, and the symbolism is slightly ironic, considering how few humans actually stayed loyal to him. In Spanish court paintings by Velázquez, small dogs sit beside the infantas, heads tilted, eyes bright, while the children pose stiffly in their wide, heavy dresses so large they probably required to servants the dogs look natural, relaxed, real. Painters understood something universal. Dogs bring warmth to any scene. Even the most rigid, ceremonial portrait softens when a dog appears. It's like history whispering. Yes, these people lived in a world of power and politics, but they also had small, affectionate creatures curled at their feet. When royal dogs received more healthcare than most people, let us drift into the era when Europe discovered early science and simultaneously decided that dogs deserved excellent medical care. By the 1700s, royal kennels often had surgeons, herbalists, bonesetters, and occasionally astrologers, because old habits die hard. A French royal veterinarian once wrote a 200-page treatise on how to care for hunting dogs, including advice on diet, exercise, and maintaining emotional well-being, centuries before modern pet psychology even existed. Meanwhile, peasants were being told to cure broken bones with herbal compresses, prayers, and a strong will. Royal dogs received hot baths, massages, polished silver feeding bowls, custom leather jackets for winter, and soft kennels lined with straw that was changed daily. One King Frederick I of Württemberg even commissioned tiny dog-sized coats embroidered with his personal crest, because obviously nothing says royalty like a miniature coat on a spaniel. the strange case of the queen who trusted dogs more than doctors. Now, let's float toward Queen Caroline of Ansbach, wife of George II of Britain, a clever woman, sharp-tongued, politically savvy, and oddly convinced that her doctors were trying to poison her. But her dogs, though she trusted completely. Caroline often requested her dogs to sit beside her during medical treatments. She said their presence soothed the nerves and dispelled unpleasant humors. The physicians, who were used to treating royals without unusual spectators, found this awkward but tolerated it. One courtier noted that while doctors argued about her health, the queen quietly stroked a spaniel as if the dog were the only calm creature in the room. And honestly, he probably was. Dogs became her emotional anchors, symbols of reassurance in a life filled with political tension and royal expectations. Their simple presence, their steady breathing, their warm company, helped her far more than the overly confident physicians with bloodletting tools. The dog who accidentally became a faith healer. Drifting now into the 18th century, we meet Prince Karl Alexander of Lorraine Bay, a charming but slightly eccentric man who believed one of his hounds had healing abilities. The dog, a large St. Hubert hound, always sat beside him when he was ill, and, coincidentally, Karl often recovered quickly. Naturally, he concluded the dog had mystical powers. Visitors would sometimes find the prince wrapped in blankets, sitting beside the dog, eyes closed, concentrating deeply as if receiving canine transmitted spiritual energy. In reality, he was probably just comforted. Dogs are good at that, but he insisted the dog carried a soothing aura, which is not entirely wrong, just very dramatic. The dog's reputation grew so much that some people actually asked to touch him for good luck. Yes, a royal healing dog. History is many things, but never boring. The dogs who witnessed the fall of empires before we drift to the end of this section. Let's hover in the late 18th century and age of revolutions, collapsing monarchies, and sudden political earthquakes. And through it all, dogs remained calm, steady, unaffected by ideology. When Louis XVI was imprisoned, several of his dogs were sent away for safety. But records show that one small dog stayed with his daughter, in captivity, a quiet companion in a world that had turned upside down. When Marie Antoinette was separated from her family, she reportedly asked only for a little dog to be brought to her. He stayed with her until nearly the end. Through the fall of empires, the collapse of dynasties, and the dismantling of centuries-old structures, dogs offered the same quiet comfort they had given medieval queens, Renaissance princes, and ancient hunters. It's the softest thread running through human history, a warm presence amid cold politics. We'll close part 7 here, right on the edge of revolution and transformation, but drifting softly, gently, without drama. If you're still awake, your breathing is probably deep by now. Your mind is wandering, and whenever you're ready, just whisper, continue part 8. And we'll drift into the final stretch of this sleepy journey toward how dogs moved into modern royalty, public culture, and the quiet, comforting companionship they still give us today. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake after 7 parts of humanity accidentally inventing its closest companion, then congratulations, you've basically outlasted every medieval king with a respiratory condition. But if you're drifting off, don't fight it. Just settle in a little deeper. Tonight, we're gliding into our final stretch, the slow, meandering path from early domesticated wolves to the thousands of extremely confused dog breeds we have today, many of which were absolutely not designed with common sense in mind. Let's drift into it, softly, slowly, like a dog half sliding off a couch but refusing to accept defeat. The dog steps fully into history by the classical era. Dogs weren't just domesticated, they were everywhere. Romans wrote about them, Greeks mythologized them, Egyptians honored them with more dignity than some pharaohs got on a Wednesday afternoon. And yet, even with all this cultural prestige, dogs were still, at their core, deeply weird. The Greeks admired hunting dogs for their elegance, while also noting that some had the habit of staring blankly into the middle distance as though contemplating the void. The Romans decorated villas with mosaics that said Cave Canum, beware of the dog even, though most of the dogs in question were small, fuzzy, and looked like they'd apologize for barking. Let's drift to medieval Europe, where dogs quietly slipped deeper into the homes, halls, and heartbeats of human life. Medieval dogs, equal parts useful and chaotic in medieval courts. Dogs occupied a strangely respected but not trusted position. They weren't nobility, but they also weren't peasants. They existed in a liminal space like an unpaid intern who somehow has access to every room in the palace. Kings adored them. Queens spoiled them. Nobles collected them like stamps they occasionally fed. Some were hunting partners, trained with incredible precision. Others existed purely as ornaments, essentially early luxury brands, with fur. And some, naturally, were just there, doing dog things, which, historically, included stealing food from kitchens, sleeping in fireplaces, getting into fights with geese, and wandering into royal ceremonies like they owned the place. There are entire chronicles describing royal dogs knocking over candles, disrupting processions, and occasionally biting important diplomats, usually the ones who absolutely deserved it. And yet, for all their antics, their loyalty cemented them firmly into everyday life. People trusted dogs in ways they didn't trust their own family. A dog wouldn't try to poison you for inheritance reasons. A dog wouldn't marry into your dynasty and destabilize the region. A dog wouldn't accidentally trigger a century-long war because someone snubbed someone else at dinner. Really, dogs were the most reliable part of medieval politics. Royal dogs, the soft spot in ruthless hearts. Some of the cruelest rulers had an unusual fondness for their dogs. It's almost charming, if you ignore everything else about them. William the Conqueror kept massive hounds and fined anyone who harmed them because, of course, his greatest emotional attachments were to animals who couldn't contest his authority. Mary, Queen of Scots, famously kept tiny lapdogs who slept in her bed and followed her everywhere. One even snuck under her skirts on the day of her execution, which is possibly the most loyal thing a dog has ever done, and also the most emotionally devastating footnote in Scottish history. Frederick the Great of Prussia adored his Italian greyhounds so much that he buried them beside his palace, wished to be buried next to them, and wrote about their personalities as though they were diplomats. He trusted them more than his ministers, which, considering Prussian politics, was probably wise. Where humans schemed, dogs offered something suspiciously rare in royal circles: sincerity. The Renaissance, dogs in art, symbolism, and silly hats. With the Renaissance came a new era of dog appreciation. People painted dogs. They sculpted dogs. They wrote poems about dogs that ranged from deeply heartfelt to "We get it, Giovanni, you have feelings." In portraits, dogs symbolized loyalty, especially in marriage scenes, where they stood politely next to couples pretending to enjoy each other's company. Medieval artists understood marriage better than most marriage counselors, and some dogs, famously, were painted wearing tiny hats, because why not? If you're already spending 3 months painting a duke, you might as well enjoy yourself a little. The birth of dog breeds. For better or worse, by the 1600s and 1700s, humanity began to refine dogs, and by refine, I mean shape them into increasingly questionable silhouettes. People wanted specialized dogs. Dogs for hunting, dogs for guarding, dogs for rat catching, dogs for sitting decoratively on pillows, dogs for being so small they could fit inside sleeves. Some breeds made sense. Greyhounds stayed elegant. Shepherd dogs remained practical. Hounds stayed hounds, which honestly is their life philosophy. But other breeds, well, let's just say the era introduced some choices. The tiny lapdogs that aristocrats loved became tinier, fluffier, and significantly more concerned about drafts. Bulldogs transformed into a shape nature absolutely never approved of. Brachycephalic breeds, dogs with pushed-in faces, began their long journey toward breathing like tiny, enthusiastic accordions. Still, despite the questionable anatomy, the affection only deepened. Dogs weren't just useful anymore. They were companions, friends, members of the household who didn't plot coups, Victorian England, where dog breeding went absolutely off the rails. If there was ever a moment when humanity collectively said, yes, let's create a dog shaped like a teapot for fun, it was the Victorian era. Queen Victoria adored dogs. She collected them with the enthusiasm of someone trying to complete a Pokédex. Her beloved Pomeranians, originally larger sled-type dogs, became increasingly small and fluffy under selective breeding. By the late 19th century, you could practically lose one inside a teacup. Victorian dog shows exploded in popularity. People showcased dogs like bizarre living sculptures, longer noses, shorter legs, fluffier coats, rounder eyes, or the general impression of a loaf with feet. This era shaped many of the breeds we recognize today. It also created several that no longer exist because they were, let's say, impractical on slippery floors. And through all these experiments in canine design, the bond remained strong. People weren't just shaping dogs. Dogs were shaping people, softening them, teaching them gentleness in a world that rarely prioritized it. Modern dogs, the best friends we designed, and who designed us back today. Dogs are astonishingly diverse. Everything from tiny chihuahuas to massive Irish wolfhounds, all descendants of that brave little wolf who decided that sleeping near human fires was a good career move. Some dogs now work, guiding the blind, detecting illnesses, rescuing people, helping with therapy, assisting law enforcement. Others do not work at all. They simply sit on couches, sleep in sunbeams, and occasionally bark at absolutely nothing. An important job they take very seriously. But whether they're working or napping, every dog carries the same ancient spark, the desire to be near us, to read our emotions, to rest their head on our knee, as if to say, I'm here, you're safe, we're okay. It's a bond tens of thousands of years old, one that outlasted empires, dynasties, plagues, revolutions, entire languages, and several very questionable fashion eras. The quiet legacy of a shared hearth. As we drift toward the end of tonight's journey, think about that first wolf, the one who took a chance on firelight instead of fear. Because of that choice, we have herding dogs, guard dogs, snuggle dogs, chaos gremlins, dogs that look like clouds, dogs that look like potatoes, dogs that look like they were printed in the wrong resolution. But most importantly, we have companionship. Soft, steady, warm-hearted companionship. Humans shaped dogs, but dogs shaped humanity. Our communities, our sense of loyalty. In a way, the story of the dog is the story of us. A long, gentle walk through time, side by side, always returning to the same hearth, always home. And now, rest if your eyes are heavy, let them close. If your breathing is slow, let it settle deeper. You've wandered through tens of thousands of years tonight, from wolf packs to royal courts, from ancient firesides to modern living rooms. So, let the last thought be soft. Somewhere, right now, a dog is dreaming, and maybe you can join them. Good night, my friend. Rest well.